Howdy friends. Real quick before we get into the video, I have opened a P.O. box, and I will likely be doing some sort of fan mail segment in the future. So if you have anything you want to send me, save things that are generally illegal, then you can send them to this address right here. Don't put P.O. box because it will sometimes not actually send to the P.O. box. Why? I couldn't fucking tell you. But feel free to send me books or art or cool things that you found. I am open to all of it. But if you send books, you have to inscribe the inside of the cover. I don't make the rules. All right, with that out of the way, let's get right into the video. When you think of bog bodies, you likely think of Europe, places like Ireland or Germany or Denmark. Your mind may jump to finds like the Gale man from Ireland. At 2,500 years old, he was found with the noose that strangled him still around his neck, staked to the bottom of a bog. What? I mean, not the best way to go. Or you may think of the Rost girl from Germany, who is the youngest bog body ever found. She was estimated to be about 3 years old, though unfortunately it's difficult to tell considering that her remains were lost during the bombings in Germany in World War II, leaving behind only her woolen shroud that had once covered her tiny body. Or most famously, perhaps you think of the Tolland man, whose haunting face is so lifelike that you can not only see the wrinkles on his forehead, but the remains of his once vibrant orange beard. It's finds like these that got many people, myself included, interested in archaeology. At the age of 5, when I first discovered my passion for archaeology, it was finds like Ötzi that really, sparked that flame. And of course, it was a logical next step to be fascinated by the bog bodies from Western Europe. But all of the bog bodies which I have mentioned so far have one thing in common. Well, two things in common, actually. Firstly, and most obviously, is that all of them are dead. And secondly, every single one of them was found in northwestern Europe. But what you may not know is that bog bodies are not unique to just this part of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Milo, and today we're going to be going across the pond to explore... There is no better time quite like a sudden and jarring scene change to talk about today's sponsor. I enjoyed this week's sponsor so much that I am going to go on to become an actual customer of theirs. This sponsor is, of course, HelloFresh. I am a big fan of good food. The problem is good food is very time consuming, but thanks to HelloFresh, it is possible to get fresh, good ingredients delivered directly to your door, which for someone who is now in their first apartment out of college is genuinely one of the nicest things I have ever experienced. Each meal comes pre-portioned.
A single piece of garlic is all you need.
And has this wonderful little recipe card that comes with it. To test out the service, we got the roasted garlic zucchini flatbread, Monterey Jack burgers, and last night we had
the shrimp chorizo.
The pre-portioned ingredients made it intuitive and convenient to make. HelloFresh allows you to pick from more than 50 different meal options, each of which are pre-portioned, high quality, and picked when they are at their prime ripeness. And they deliver their food right from a farm directly to your doorstep. Not only this, but it is significantly cheaper than doing grocery runs. I can't help but appreciate how HelloFresh, by centralizing the process, they are able to make it a lot more carbon efficient than your average grocery run.
Give it a seal of approval.
Go to HelloFresh.com and use code MiniMinuteman to get 16 meals across 7 boxes plus 3 gifts for free. These gifts can include appetizers, desserts, or premium recipes.
Nice.
Once you click, my description will live update to count up the purchases. Big thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. And now, without further ado, let's get right back into it. Here, crazy transition, let's go. The year is 1982. Ronald Reagan and Margaret taking milk from schoolchildren Thatcher denounced the ideologies of the Soviet Union. A gallon of gas costed 90 cents, and car radios in Ford Escorts across America blast the infectiously catchy refrain of Don't You Want Me. And just west of Cape Canaveral, Florida, in a town known as Titusville, construction begins on a new segment of road leading to a housing development. The access road to this new housing development had to be run through a pond, which of course it did. It's in Florida, which is pretty much in all aspects one giant pond. As construction begins, a backhoe operator by the name of Steve Vanderjagt discovers something odd in the bucket of his backhoe. At first, it appeared to be a rock, and considering he was working in boggy marshland, this stood as odd. After hopping down from his truck to investigate further, he was shocked and horrified to find that what he had seen was a human skull. But what they didn't know at the time was that this skull was just the tip of the iceberg, and that inadvertently, this construction crew had stumbled across one of the most important archaeological sites in America, a location which would soon become known as the... Windover Archaeological Site stands on its own against pretty much every other archaeological site in North America. Firstly, bog bodies are already incredibly rare on this continent, and so finding any of them is something to note in and of itself. Like with many archaeological sites concerning human remains, originally it was believed to be the location of a murder. When Steve found the skull in his bucket truck, of course the first response was to call the authorities. Police who came to the scene were almost immediately able to identify that these bones were a lot older than any modern murder victim, which left them with the next option, which is that they had stumbled upon an archaeological site. Professor Glen Doran of Florida State University was called to the scene in order to investigate the find. He was the former chairman of the Florida State University Archaeological and Anthropological Department, and so obviously he's the kind of guy that you want to have involved when you're digging around in the mud with a guy named Steve. One of the first things that Professor Doran noticed was that the teeth on these skulls was far more worn down than one would expect in a modern individual. Modern people are a bunch of pussies, and all of our food is really soft and really lame, and so we die without ever actually doing any sort of meaningful wear on our teeth. But ancient people were hardcore, and they didn't have toothbrushes, dentists, or Wonder Bread. And the wear on these teeth suggested that they had been eating a far more diverse diet than modern humans. Professor Doran was able to confirm that what they were looking at was the remains of an ancient burial complex. And even after the initial investigation, which yielded 5 skulls and 3 human bones, it was already the largest assemblage of human remains of this age in the entirety of North America. And Professor Doran knew that this site had a veritable treasure trove of information to be learned. So they decided to conduct a full-scale archaeological excavation. But the problem is they were working in a bog down in the valley. Every Rattling Bog reference in this video goes out to Quinn and David, who one night traumatized me by singing that song to me about 4 times on repeat. So in that bog, there was some water. Rare water, rattling water. Such a stupid fucking joke. In 1984, enough funding had been raised that a full-scale archaeological operation was underway. To begin this operation, they needed to pump all of the water out of the bog, which consisted of this team installing 130 wells capable of pumping out 1,000 gallons of water per minute. And the pumps got to work, inundating the rest of Florida in shitty, boggy swamp water. As the water receded, allowing for archaeologists to be able to dig at the site, they found that they weren't looking at a few one-off graves, or sacrificial remains like you see in Europe. Instead, what they were looking at was a sprawling community cemetery of a scale and age unlike anything ever found in North America. The remains of these bodies rested halfway down a 20-foot layer of peat. The Windover site had a peat profile that went down about 20 feet, and the human remains found at the site were all deposited around the 10-foot horizon. Sorry, I'm not left-handed because I'm not a fucking loser. And this 10-foot horizon throughout the bog yielded a staggering amount of human remains. Throughout the course of the excavation, the initial 5 skulls found would expand to 168 human bodies. By and large, the remains found in the bog were laid to rest on their left side, with their heads oriented to the west of their pelvis. And as my wonderful drawing depicts, many of them were buried in the fetal position. In fact, only 3 of the individuals found at the Windover site were buried lying on their backs as we bury our dead today. As of right now, archaeologists still aren't entirely sure of the significance of this position of burial, but considering that it was so consistent throughout the site, it is likely that there was some sort of reason for doing it. Typically, different civilizations will find different significances with the rising and setting sun and bury their dead according to that, but right now it is only speculation as to why so many of the bodies were buried on their left side, facing north, with their heads facing west. Rest easy, sweet prince. Rest easy. As is indicated by how consistent the burial orientations were, it is clear that these people were buried with a serious amount of ceremony surrounding it. These were not the remains of people who were merely discarded in the bog after dying. These were elaborate funerary rituals to lay the deceased to rest. Many of the remains were covered in fabric shrouds, the oldest of their kind in the entirety of North America, which is one of the most important things they found at the site, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Many of the remains were found with the fabric shrouds covering them impaled with sticks in order to keep the body held at the bottom of the water. This would have ensured that the body did not float to the surface and was not able to be accessed by scavenging animals. And all of these efforts in order to keep the bodies from floating was wildly successful. Out of the staggering 10,000 pieces of human remains found at the site, only 6 had any evidence of being gnawed on by scavenging animals. Now, all of this information was fascinating to Doran and the rest of his team, but of course there is always the one overarching question, which is, how old is it? Right off the bat, Doran figured that this site was far older than anything he had ever worked with. One of the primary reasons for thinking this was because the site didn't have any evidence of clay pottery. At this time, it was believed that pottery began to appear in the archaeological record about 4,000 years ago, and it was quite common after that point. Since this site had a plethora of different grave artifacts alongside it, but none of them were pottery, Doran decided that this site had the potential to be far older than that 4,000 year mark. But older than 4,000 years is really fucking vague. And there was only one way to know for sure. Time to draw a new title. Tag your weird 24-year-old friend who's dating an 18-year-old. Yes, it is weird. I don't care if she's mature for her age. You're just a shithead. The only way to truly know how old this discovery was to date it. But dating dead people needs to be handled very carefully. And there are many different types of dating in the world of archaeology. In my last video, I talked about surface exposure dating, or cosmogenic radionucleotide dating if you want to make someone's head explode, which is a dating method which is used on rocks in order to determine when the last time was that they were in contact with the sky. But there's a bunch of other methods as well. There are things like KR, or potassium argon dating, which is another dating method which can be used on also rocks, actually, oddly enough. I don't know why I picked two rock examples to use in this video, but it's a little bit different. It's used to date rocks and see how long ago they were created through processes of heat. But I really don't feel like talking about KR dating because it sucks and it has nothing to do with this video. So today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite, which is C14 dating. Now, right off the bat, I know that there are about to be comments below this video saying stuff like, how is it possible to radiocarbon date something because it was found in water and therefore radiocarbon dating doesn't work, throw it all out the window, science is a lie, and the Earth is 6,000 years old. I get comments like that all the time, both on TikTok and on YouTube. Typically, it is young Earth creationist talking points and people trying to undermine pretty much all of archaeology. But one thing that I found that's kind of concerning is this lie has perpetuated to the point where people now just think that artifacts found in water can't be radiocarbon dated. In reality, things found in water, for the most part, can be radiocarbon dated. There are a couple situations where they cannot be. It is more common in salt water than in fresh water because salt water interacts with the C14 differently than fresh water does, and it has a result that causes things to appear older than they actually are. But since scientists are scientists, they are able to sort of account for how the environment that the artifact was found in will affect the C14 date. Now, in a freshwater environment, like at the Windover site, there is less contamination that comes from this fresh water. In a freshwater environment, the type of water you have to be the most concerned about is hard water, which is water with a very high dissolved mineral content. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is a boggy environment in Florida, meaning that it is primarily natural organic plant material and not a lot of, well, minerals. The fact that Steve got off of his bucket truck because he thought he found a rock proves that this environment does not have a lot of stones in it. Hard water is typically found in groundwater aquifers because they are locked up in stone. And in a site like this, the water would not have really caused that much of a problem. Anyway, that is a very long-winded way of saying that they decided to date the Windover site by using radiocarbon dating. I thought I'd sneak a little bit of science in there for you, even though it really doesn't have too much to do with the story. It's kind of like when your mom would put like peas in your mac and cheese in order to trick you into eating vegetables. To figure out how old the Windover site was, they decided to radiocarbon date a piece of one of the skulls found there. Well, several pieces of skulls, because you need to have multiple data points. You know what I mean. But the results obtained from these skulls were incredible. The burials of the site were found to be from about a 1,000-year span, centered around 6,300 BCE, meaning that the people who buried at this site lived between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago. This site is older than the pyramids of Giza by 3,700 years. It predates the so-called rise of civilization. I absolutely hate that term, by the way, because it implies that civilization requires everyone to be living in one place and, you know, having writing and a monarchy and all that shit. These people were a civilization. Anyone who tries to tell you otherwise is viewing human history from an overarchingly European lens. At the time when this civilization civilization lived in Florida, it would have been wildly different than what it is today. For starters, the Florida Panhandle would have been nearly twice the size. During the end of the Pleistocene into the beginning of the Holocene, much of the Earth's water was locked up in glacial ice. By this time, about 9,000 years ago, much of that ice would have begun to melt, but the sea levels were still globally far lower than they are today. And the landscape that these people walked would have been much different than the boggy, humid landscape of today's Florida. Instead of a Florida which is dominated by swampland, giant mice, and a city spawned out of a drunk frat pledge's chlamydia-induced fever dream, the Panhandle would have resembled more of a savanna, a cool, dry grassland where for thousands of years the Earth's last megafauna would have grazed. It is more than likely that the people who are buried along this site would have, or at least in the past few generations, walked alongside the last of the American camels and the armored glyptodon. The age and levels of preservation at this site offer us a amazing window into what the world would have been like at the end of the Pleistocene. But before I get too carried away talking about how amazing it is to think about the world these people would have lived in, we have to talk about the preservation at the site. And all that preservation was there because the site was truly a bogs are unique environments when it comes to preservation, and the primary reason for this is because bogs are anoxic. Anoxic means that there is not a lot of oxygen in the environment, as you could probably tell, and oxygen is a primary driver in decomposition because it allows for many organisms to respirate. This is why if you die and fall on the ground, you will eventually decompose. But if you die and fall in a bog, you probably will decomplode a lot slower. To change the word decompose to decomplode. This is why so many of the human remains found in bogs are found at an inhibited state of decomposition, and why in cases like the Tolland Man, despite being in a bog for 2,300 years and not decomposing, when they are exposed to the air, they will rapidly decompose, which is a fucking shame. But, you know, it's one of those things that ends up happening with archaeologists, where they do something because they're really cocky, and then they fuck it up a whole bunch. But while bogs are sort of a blanket term, bog environments themselves can be vastly different from one another. Things like pH, or the acidity of a bog, can be very different from place to place. Obviously, the temperature as well, and the age. Now, most bogs have a pH of around 3 or 4, which means that they are acidic. But the Windover site was very interesting because it had a pH of 7, which means that it was exactly neutral, or more or less neutral. Which is why for all of these images, you are not seeing any sort of flesh preservation as you would expect to see in bog bodies of Europe. At the Windover site, the flesh, muscle, and skin of these individuals has decomposed, which is why they don't look quite like the ones that you would expect to see in Eastern Europe. This is because not only is the bog environment different, but they are also, more than almost 3 or 4 times as old? So if you're disappointed that they don't have any flesh on them and you can't go ooh and ah at their face, I'd like to see what you look like in 9,000 years, you judgmental bastard. Instead of flesh and skin, the Windover inhabitants are now just bone. Though they do have a little bit of a unique piece of their bog with them. The bone is very heavily discolored, as you can see, and this was something which occurred because of the natural tannin in the water and in the soil. This ended up staining the bones this sort of rich brown color that they appear as today. Now, while the flesh and skin may be long gone, the bog did preserve something which was absolutely groundbreaking. Out of the almost 170 human bodies found at the Windover site, 90 of them were found with intact brains. I don't even know how to process it. It's incredible. It's really, really fucking cool. It's one thing to look at the face of someone who walked the earth thousands of years ago, but it's another to know that their brain that once held everything they have ever thought is still in some form intact. It's honestly a little existential, and I don't know how long I can think about it without freaking out. The brains of these ancient people were not the only things that were preserved by the bog. The Windover bog also preserved stories. Stories of... Archaeologists believe that the former inhabitants of the Windover site were members of an ancient hunting-gathering community. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things which makes this site so unique is that it's not a mass burial or the remains of human sacrifices. It is instead a sprawling community cemetery. Some of the indicators that this was not sort of a sacrificial site or the site of some sort of massacre is that there is an even split between men and women, which statistically indicates that both men and women will eventually die. If this were an archaeological site that was the remains of a mass grave from a war or from some other form of conflict, you would likely find not only evidence on the human remains, but there would also be an overwhelming amount of remains on one side of the gender spectrum. For example, in Europe, most mass graves of warriors would be male skeletons, and that trend also continues in the Americas. Or if it had been the site of a tragedy, such as a massacre, it would be more likely to find just women and children. But the even split of gender is something which indicates that these people all died for varying reasons over varying amounts of time. Another thing about the site which is fascinating is the distribution of age. Of the nearly 170 human remains found at the site, about half of them were under the age of 20, which by our modern standards seems like a very, very high young mortality rate. But we have to keep in mind that we are viewing this through a modern lens, where our mortality rate is incredibly low, in comparison to ancient people, that is. Now, while this may seem like a lot of young people buried at this site, it is actually a very small fraction compared to what you see in even later, more advanced societies. This 50-50 split of the age bracket right around the age of 20 is actually a fairly good young mortality rate, indicating that these individuals actually lived quite long and healthy lives. Another indication of the sustainability of this lifestyle is individuals aged up to 70 years old, which 70 would become an age that was almost unattainable once you begin to develop into sedentary civilizations. The age of 70 certainly goes against what we view as a stereotypical hunter-gatherer society, where we think, they're a bunch of brutes with clubs who die by 30. There was also evidence of a large amount of structure in this society, as many of these burials took place within 48 hours of the deceased deceasing. The way that archaeologists were able to determine this is that in the Florida temperatures and humidity at the time, and especially currently, a human brain will liquefy within about 72 hours. By interring the body within the first 48, they were able to preserve for the last almost 9,000 years. This indicates that there was a lot of care taken around burying these individuals. Not only were the bodies interred shortly after death, but the goods that were buried alongside them, as well as their burial shrouds, orientations, and the stakes that held them down, are all a fairly elaborate operation, meaning that this civilization had the time, energy, and resources to spare when burying their deceased loved ones. We also think that this group was semi-sedentary. Many indigenous groups before contact, especially in my native New England, would spend their summers on the seashore harvesting the bounty of mussels and fish, while they would spend their winters going inland. And this cycle would continue year in and year out. Our evidence to suggest that these individuals acted in much the same way is the fact that there are pollen samples retrieved from the site indicate that these individuals were all buried around the summer months, specifically between the months of July and October. We know this by analyzing the pollen samples not only on the fabric that the deceased were buried in, but also in their stomach contents. A bog is also just a wealth of paleoecological information, as it tends to be a trap for pollen. Each layer is kind of its own little snapshot into what the environment was like at that point in history. As I mentioned earlier, the Windover bog also has the oldest fabric samples in the entirety of North America. Many of the burials were wrapped with care in an ancient textile. And incredibly, this site is the only evidence that we have that these ancient hunting-gathering societies had the technology to weave. Dr. James Adavasio is a leading expert in textiles in the United States, and he was one of the ones who actually analyzed the find himself. The fabric that this civilization made was created out of twine. A twine, while we may just think of it as, being something you use in your garden, consists of 2 or more pieces of rope or some sort of material wound together. It's pretty much just 2 little threads that are wrapped. This kind of looks like DNA. That was unintentional, but I'm gonna roll with it. The fabric was then woven out of this ancient twine, implying that there were multiple steps in creating a finished product. And this was absolutely groundbreaking information. Up until this point, there was no evidence that anyone nearly this old knew how to create something this complex. And this just shatters the idea that the paleo-indigenous people of North America were, or the paleo-indigenous people of really anywhere, were these just knuckle-dragging brutes, you know, wearing like bloody animal skins and, you know, again, beating each other with clubs. We've all seen the fucking, you know, depictions of it in pretty much any form of media ever. These people were not that. I cannot stress that enough. Not only were these people highly advanced in their ability to weave and create fabric, but they were also highly in tune with their environment. Paleobotanists who researched the site found the remains of pollinomorphs, which are pretty much ancient pollens, and they can tell you a wealth about a paleoecological environment. And they are an absolute pain in the ass for anyone who has taken a paleoecology course. I could barely stand it for, you know, a cumulative 3 hours, and I knew people in that class who did it as a job, like day in and day out, just looking at pollen under a microscope. And if you do that, I have an unparalleled amount of respect for you. Paleobotanists were able to identify plants which currently live in the area, such as live oak, mulberry, swamp ash, and willow. They also found evidence of the American elm, which, as many of you know, is a much more rare species in the United States. The loss of the elm tree in the United States was primarily due to the introduction of Dutch elm disease in the 1950s, which absolutely decimated the continental population. While modern paleobotanists are very aware of what this ancient environment used to be like, there is one group of people who are far more aware of what this ancient environment used to be like, and that is, of course, the people who lived in it. While the skin and flesh of these people has long since worn away, their stomach contents are still present. And there is a myriad of things which you can learn from analyzing ancient stomach contents. Firstly, we know that these individuals, at least in the season when they were buried, had a diet which consisted primarily of fruits and berries. Not only this, but there is evidence that these individuals knew how to use the plants around them for their medicinal purposes. The excavation of one of the women buried at the site found high concentrations of holly, elderberry, and nightshade. Holly modernly can be used to treat coughs when used correctly. The berries are poisonous, so I mean, I guess that would treat your cough. You'd never cough again. And it's even been used by different indigenous groups more recently in order to brew a type of tea which can act as a bit of a heart stimulant. Similarly, elderberry has also been used in order to treat cold and flu symptoms. And nightshade all contain a very high concentration of alkaloids, which today we know that alkaloids are an anti-inflammatory as well as an antibacterial. It is more than likely that this woman consumed these various things in order to try and treat an ailment which she ended up dying from. What this ailment may have been, we may never know, as only the stomach contents remain. And there are plenty of other artifacts which indicate how advanced these people were. Not only are there mortars and pestles, but there is a double-ended pestle, which is just fucking genius. You can pestle twice as fast. There are also animal snares and bone tools. Quite a few of the bone tools are made from things which you would expect. Things like white-tailed deer bones, as well as possum bones and turtle shells. But there were some bone tools found that were not made from what you would expect, including the remains of bobcats, manatees, and sharks. It is unclear whether or not these animals were hunted by this group of people, but the fact that they were found as grave goods indicates that they were very well part of possibly their diet, or at least their culture. Now, it's easy to assume that this group of people is the ancestor of modern indigenous groups, but at least at the time when this DNA research was done, there was actually no concrete evidence found between them and any group existing in the area. Now, before you go, oh my god, they must be aliens, I promise you they're not. In reality, DNA holds up really. I knew I drew DNA for a reason, see? DNA does not hold up very well because it's small and fragile. That typically doesn't go well with being buried in a bog for 9,000 years. So while they weren't able to draw any concrete conclusions from the DNA, it is more than likely that this group is likely a parent group to modern indigenous groups in the area. I said group way too many times. And by bringing it to the present, I think it is time to smoothly transition to probably the most important takeaway from this. Today, the Windover site remains half unexcavated. This was done under the impression that as technology progresses and the field of archaeology becomes more fleshed out, people will be able to approach the site later with better techniques and methods in order to learn more about it. And it's amazing to think about that. It's amazing to think about all the things we could learn from it and all of the things we have. And as archaeologists, it's really easy to look at all of these things as artifacts or as subjects. In fact, it's almost logical to do so. If you are working with thousands of artifacts, it makes more sense to number them than to to name them. Even finds like Tomai that I talked about in my last video, I referred to him by his given name, but in reality he was referred to much of the time with a serial number. As archaeologists, I almost think we have a little bit of a diligence to begin to separate ourselves from that. And while yes, when doing a dig, it is important to be able to remember all the stuff that you've dug up, at the end of the day, you have to always remember to put it into perspective, so that when you look at this skull, you remember that you are not just looking at some inanimate object. You are looking at a person, just like you and just like me. Someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's partner, someone's lover, or someone's friend. Behind their now empty eye sockets are the remains of a brain which once held everything they ever felt and everything they ever knew. Stories that made them laugh, experiences that made them cry. You are looking at the remains of someone who once felt deeply. The brightest flames of love and the deepest stabs of anger. In every way except the place they were brought up in, these people were exactly like us. And by referring to them as subjects and artifacts, we remove ourselves from that very human truth. Today, their stories are all but lost to us. But it's amazing to think that at the bottom of this bog is all that remains of a civilization of people who walked the earth 9,000 years ago. I want to dedicate this video to Professor Glen Doran. He was the dig leader at the Windover Archaeological site. All of this happened because of him and his passion. And I found his page through the Florida State University directory. And I wanted to see if I could contact him to maybe do an interview and talk to him about this site. And I learned that he passed away in June of last year, which was very sad. Definitely not a surprise that I wanted to have. But rather than wallowing in sadness, I want to thank Dr. Glen Doran for all that he has done for the world of archaeology and for giving us this wealth of information from this site. So wherever you are, Professor Doran, Godspeed. Okay, outro time. Firstly and foremostly, I would like to thank my viewer and patron, David, for donating this wonderful microphone that I have been recording with. This is now my third microphone. I'm really stacking up the L's on this one. But at least in the test audio that I've done of it, it's quite good. So David, thank you for helping make my production quality a little bit better and helping make everyone else's ears bleed a little bit less. Once again, I have opened a P.O. box. Send cool stuff to it if you would like. I will be doing an unboxing of cool things at some point. Maybe I'll go to the post office in like a week or something and see if anything's there. Again, and I cannot stress this enough, nothing illegal or dangerous. I do not want to be responsible or dead. And no live animals or human organs. Someone in my last stream offered to send me their kidney. Please do not do that. I do not want your kidney. I also don't want anyone else's kidney. No kidney, no organs. Draw the line there. Also, check me out on Instagram and Twitter for a more insider look at my life and my unhinged stream of consciousness, as well as video updates and all that, but that's secondary. As always, I would like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Patrons get early, ad-free access to all of my videos. If you're interested in becoming a patron, the link to that is fucking somewhere. I think it's on my profile somewhere. The names of my patrons will all be in the credits of my video, so if you are one of my patrons, stick around for that. Remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and most importantly, remember to bury your loved ones with your prized double-ended pestle so they can pestle twice as fast in the great beyond.